The galaxy had been locked in war for longer than humanity had even touched the stars. Ancient empires, vast and patient, had ground against one another in endless cycles of destruction and uneasy truces. Their fleets were colossal, their weapons refined over millennia, their doctrines carved from centuries of attrition. The conflicts they waged were not swift or decisive, but ritualistic in a way, predictable stalemates where each side measured losses in the billions yet preserved just enough strength to fight again tomorrow. To those who lived within the galactic core, war was simply the background hum of existence, a tide that rose and fell but never truly changed. In this endless clash, every species played its part according to its nature. The reptilian Vorth valued rigid hierarchy, every battle a chessboard moved by distant commanders. The insect KY-Ra relied on swarms, overwhelming enemies with numbers but incapable of improvisation. The crystalline Kesh favored perfect defense, their fleets forming walls of glittering armor that bent under pressure but never broke. Each civilization's strategy was shaped by biology and tradition, unchanging as the stars. The war, for all its devastation, was a machine that ran on familiar gears. And then, far at the edges of known space, there was humanity. A young race, barely a few centuries removed from combustion engines, crawling tentatively from their home system into the interstellar frontier. Their ships were small, inelegant by galactic standards, and their colonies few. Most of the elder races barely registered their existence. When the Council of Sectors spoke of them, it was as a curiosity, a minor species who would either integrate quietly into trade networks or collapse under the weight of their own ambition. To the great powers, humans were fragile. Their bodies weak compared to armored reptilians, their lifespans short compared to crystalline monarchs who remembered entire dynasties of war. Their technology was a patchwork of stolen ideas and frantic invention, never polished, never elegant. A race that bickered among themselves, fractured by borders and politics. In the eyes of the galaxy, humanity would never be more than a footnote. But what the galaxy failed to understand was the way humans thrived in the margins. Where other species sought comfort and order, humans embraced chaos. Where others fought only when survival demanded it, humans carried conflict within their history like a heartbeat. They had not endured millennia of ritualized stalemates, but centuries of total wars, revolutions, and upheavals that reshaped their world again and again. They were a people accustomed to rebuilding from ashes, to clawing their way forward when logic said they should have perished. The war among the stars paid little attention to Earth at first. Fleets clashed light years away, worlds burned, and treaties broke in halls where human diplomats were barely tolerated. Observers, they were called. Curious primates too new to be trusted with real power. Yet, in those halls, humanity listened. They studied the alien generals who spoke in measured tones of honor and attrition. They watched the maps where borders shifted like tides, never final. And they began to understand that the war was not unwinnable. It was merely trapped in patterns. Still, none expected them to act. What influence could a minor species have against empires that had been killing one another since before the pyramids were raised on Earth? Humanity's fleets were laughable by comparison, their weapons crude imitations. The galaxy looked past them, as one looks past ants crawling at the edge of a battlefield. Yet beneath that dismissal lay a dangerous miscalculation. For while the elder species had grown weary of endless campaigns, humanity's wars were still fresh in their memory. Their grandfathers had fought global conflicts, their parents had lived through revolutions of industry and ideology. They carried scars of firebombed cities, mushroom clouds, genocides narrowly averted or committed. To them, war was not ceremony. War was survival. War was absolute. When the first human colonies along the fringe were struck by raiders, nothing more than opportunistic strikes ignored by the great powers, something shifted. The reports of massacres, of settlements erased, stirred an anger the galaxy did not recognize. Other species accepted such losses as inevitable, the price of endless conflict. Humanity did not. They saw it not as a tragic footnote but as an offense demanding answer. They did not mourn quietly and retreat into statistics. They clenched their fists. At first, alien diplomats tried to soothe them. They told humanity this was the way of things, that the war had no true beginning and no foreseeable end, that patience was wisdom. But patience was not the language of Earth. In council chambers, human representatives stared back with eyes that did not soften. They were not listening for excuses. They were weighing the cost of entering the storm. The galaxy believed they had centuries yet before humans could matter, if they ever did. But time was something humanity had never waited for. They leapt where others crept. They gambled where others calculated. And now, with their people slain and their honor called, the choice before them was no choice at all. The galaxy trembled, though it did not yet realize why. A new force had stirred at the edges, one not bound by the traditions of attrition, one unafraid of sacrifice, one forged by a history of surviving against itself. Humanity was watching the war. And soon they would join it. The decision came not with celebration, but with a grim clarity. The images of burned colonies spread through Earth's networks until no one could ignore them. Entire settlements silenced, families slaughtered, vessels drifting as wreckage. For the old empires, such losses were routine, a grim arithmetic of war. For humanity, it was a wound carved into the collective will. Politicians argued over alliances, military leaders debated logistics. But beneath every discussion was the same truth: humanity would not endure as bystanders. The coalition that received humanity's pledge of arms regarded it as symbolic, a gesture of solidarity rather than a promise of power. To them, human fleets were little more than auxiliaries, escorts meant to free up the veteran navies for real combat. The first assignments reflected that view: convoy protection, rear-line patrols, token garrisons on worlds thought too minor to be targeted. The alien commanders smiled politely, reassured that the fledgling species would make itself useful without disrupting the established balance. But from the moment the first human warships departed Earth, everything began to diverge from expectation. The vessels themselves bore the mark of their builders, rugged, inelegant, assembled from alloys that lacked the brilliance of alien composites. Yet they carried redundancies, backups stacked upon backups, systems designed not for graceful efficiency but for sheer stubborn endurance. Where other fleets demanded precision maintenance and scheduled retreats, human ships pushed past thresholds, crews improvising repairs with whatever material lay at hand. Their commanders did not wait for detailed orders from distant admirals. They adapted. The first encounter was small, almost forgettable. A raiding flotilla of enemy vessels ambushed a supply route, expecting a brief clash before vanishing into faster engines. The human escort should have retreated, preserving cargo for later. That was the tradition, the unwritten rule among elder species. Resources could be replaced, fleets must be conserved. Instead, the humans fought. Their frigates split formation, drew fire upon themselves, and then surged forward, hammering the enemy with volleys launched at ranges considered reckless. One ship rammed directly into a cruiser, detonating in an explosion that crippled the larger vessel. The convoy survived, bloodied but intact. Reports of the battle rippled outward. To some it was recklessness, to others madness. To the humans, it was simply the only acceptable outcome. Retreat was not in their vocabulary when civilians were at stake. Commanders of other races shook their heads at the waste of material, unable to comprehend how sacrifice could be measured as victory. But among the rank and file of the coalition, whispers began to spread: these humans were different. Soon, larger fleets were dispatched, this time with humans placed deliberately under close supervision. Alien admirals expected discipline to be enforced, deviations punished. Instead, they found themselves confronted with a chaos they could neither control nor dismiss. Humans deployed electronic interference at levels considered dishonorable, hijacking enemy transmissions and flooding channels with false orders. They sent decoy vessels stripped of life support to lure ambushes. They disabled captured ships, turned their own guns upon their allies, and broadcast psychological taunts across the battlefield. Each tactic was effective, each one unsettling, and none of them fit within the rigid doctrines of galactic war. At first, opponents treated these methods as anomalies. A strange but ultimately irrelevant quirk of an unseasoned species. Yet anomaly became pattern. Time and again, human fleets turned engagements predicted as losses into improbable victories. They struck from asteroid fields, used gravity wells as traps, feigned retreats before circling back with suicidal ferocity. What others saw as reckless waste, humans saw as calculated risk. And their enemies began to learn that calculation was not easy when facing a people who redefined what risk meant. The turning point came with the defense of a coalition's stronghold thought certain to fall. The enemy dispatched overwhelming numbers, confident the humans would scatter with the rest of the garrison. Instead, the human detachment fought with a fury that stunned both friend and foe. They did not hold the line in traditional formation. They fractured it, created chaos, forced the enemy to split into confused skirmishes. By the time reinforcements arrived, the attackers had been driven off, their numerical advantage undone by disarray. The cost was high, half the human fleet lay in ruins, but the stronghold stood, and the legend began. From that moment, alien commanders no longer dismissed humanity as auxiliaries. They regarded them with wary fascination, uncertain whether to admire or restrain them. For the enemy, fascination hardened into fear. Their strategists, long accustomed to mapping wars within predictable frameworks, now faced a foe that shredded those frameworks with every engagement. It was no longer possible to anticipate outcomes through precedent. Humanity had entered the war, and precedent had died. The galaxy, for the first time in centuries, felt something new stirring in its ancient conflict: unpredictability. The coalition soon realized that humanity's value was not measured in ships or numbers, but in the qualities that no other species could imitate. The first was resilience. Where other soldiers collapsed under wounds that should have been fatal, humans clawed back from the edge. Medics of the crystalline Kesh were astonished to see men and women stand again after injuries that would have ended their own kind. Limbs replaced, lungs scarred, bones rebuilt with crude grafts, humans returned to the field, grim and determined. To them, survival was not just biology but defiance, and this unsettled those who had never seen such tenacity. The second was adaptability. Alien militaries perfected doctrines over millennia, each one rigidly aligned with their nature. But humans carried no such limits. They tore apart captured weapons, jury-rigged systems not meant to function together, and devised tactics on the edge of catastrophe. A mining vessel stripped of cargo became a gun platform. A civilian freighter, armored with scavenged plating, bluffed its way into enemy lines as a warship. Every engagement revealed some new improvisation, leaving allies astonished and enemies scrambling to adjust. Commanders of rival empires soon recognized the impossibility of prediction. Battle simulations built on centuries of precedent faltered against human ingenuity. One week, they would swarm like predators, striking from every angle. The next, they would vanish into stealth and reappear behind enemy lines. Every time a pattern seemed to form, it collapsed under the weight of human creativity. It was not simply strategy. It was an instinct to twist the rules until victory emerged from unlikely angles. Then came sacrifice. Other species valued preservation of resources above all else. Wars were prolonged to avoid crippling losses. Humanity shattered that expectation. When a civilian world faced annihilation, a fleet of human cruisers stood alone against overwhelming numbers, holding long enough for evacuation before being obliterated. Reports described their final transmissions: calm, steady voices buying minutes with their lives. In galactic history, such sacrifice was rare, even unthinkable. For humans, it was not an aberration but a duty. Allied soldiers, who once mocked their frail allies, began to speak of them with reverence. Stories spread of human marines fighting to the last round, then with knives, then with bare hands. Entire platoons lost but remembered because they refused to yield ground. In mess halls across the coalition, alien recruits listened to human veterans tell tales of wars on Earth, trenches, invasions, cities consumed in fire, and realized this was not new to them. This was heritage. Where other species saw war as an interruption of life, humanity carried it in their bones. But perhaps most disquieting was the human capacity for belief. For many galactic powers, war was fought for resources, territory, or political advantage. Humanity fought for ideas. Freedom, justice, vengeance, abstractions that drove them beyond rational limits. Alien tacticians noted the danger in this, for no calculation could account for a people willing to fight simply because surrender was unthinkable. Human fleets rallied not around orders, but around conviction. And conviction proved a weapon as potent as any plasma cannon. Enemy intelligence reports recorded with growing alarm the psychological shock human presence inflicted. Entire units broke under pressure when confronted with enemies who seemed to embrace death rather than fear it. Propaganda campaigns failed, for humans turned them into fuel, defiance rising with every attempt at intimidation. The phrase whispered among alien officers spread quickly. "Do not corner them. They will not stop." This impact did not remain confined to the battlefield. In political chambers once dominated by ancient voices, human representatives began to shape debate. Their arguments were blunt, often uncomfortable, but difficult to ignore. They pressed for swifter action, decisive strikes, and strategies that rejected the endless stalemates. Slowly, the coalition shifted under their influence, not out of trust but out of recognition that human methods worked. The galaxy had grown used to caution, humanity demanded momentum. The cost was immense. Casualty rates among human forces were staggering compared to older species. Yet rather than deterring them, it hardened resolve. Each name added to memorials became a rallying cry. Entire populations volunteered for service, driven by outrage and determination. Factories burned day and night, spitting out ships at a pace that shocked neighbors. For humanity, the war was not a distant conflict but a shared burden carried by all. And as the months turned into years, one truth became undeniable. Humanity had not simply entered the war, they had changed its very nature. No longer was it a contest of attrition waged by predictable fleets. It had become a storm of improvisation, sacrifice, and unrelenting willpower. The galaxy, bound for so long by ancient traditions, now faced an enemy who fought as though every battle were the last stand of their species. The others fought because they had to. Humanity fought because they refused to do anything less. Humanity's presence in the war did not merely shift tactics, it destabilized the very balance that had endured for centuries. Where the elder species once calculated their campaigns in measured increments, now they confronted a new rhythm, fast, aggressive, unpredictable. The shockwaves spread far beyond the battlefields. Entire alliances wavered as leaders questioned whether their old doctrines could withstand this relentless new partner. At first, some tried to imitate what humans had demonstrated. Fleets of the insect HFY experimented with erratic maneuvers, attempting to replicate chaos. Yet imitation lacked the human instinct for improvisation. Without the cultural foundation of risk-taking, their formations collapsed into disorder. The crystalline Kesh, masters of defense, tried to adopt offensive strategies modeled on human assaults, but their rigid command structures crumbled under the pressure of constant adaptation. No matter how carefully they studied, they could not recreate the volatile mix of creativity and audacity that defined Earth's warriors. Enemies fared even worse. Their strategists, long accustomed to drawing upon centuries of precedent, found their predictions useless. Every plan devised to counter human tactics unraveled as soon as the fighting began. When reinforced strongholds were built to deter direct assault, humans bypassed them through daring strikes against supply chains. When decoys were deployed to bait fleets, humans turned the trap upon its makers, striking the real targets while ignoring the bait entirely. It was not technology that gave them this edge, but a willingness to abandon convention. Whispers spread across command circles. Humans escalated wars in ways others dared not. Where traditional combat sought containment, humans pursued resolution. Where losses were measured in material, humans measured them in meaning. Alien generals learned quickly that facing humanity meant facing an enemy who would never be satisfied with stalemate. Even in apparent defeat, human forces clawed for every inch of ground, leaving enemies drained, fractured, and fearful. The psychological impact grew undeniable. Entire sectors began to tremble at the rumor of human fleets approaching. Civilian populations within enemy territory demanded their leaders reconsider strategies, unwilling to provoke a species that fought as though extinction were preferable to surrender. For the first time in generations, empires that had once wielded terror as a weapon found themselves on the defensive, facing adversaries who could not be cowed. In major offensives, humanity took the role of vanguard. They did not hold positions, they shattered them. Coalition fleets once content to wait for overwhelming strength now advanced under human pressure, driven by the certainty that their new allies would carry the line forward regardless of cost. Victories accumulated at a pace unseen in the long conflict, breaking sieges once thought unbreakable and liberating territories resigned to endless occupation. Alien soldiers who once looked down upon their human counterparts now drew confidence from their presence. Morale shifted across the coalition, fueled by the knowledge that the humans would not retreat. This psychological anchor changed battles before they even began. Where once hesitation dominated, boldness took root. Humanity's fury was contagious. Fear, however, spread with equal speed among their enemies. Commanders faced an unsettling calculation. How do you fight an opponent who accepts annihilation as victory if it secures their objective? Rumors of entire enemy fleets withdrawing at the mere confirmation of human involvement multiplied. Alien analysts who had once dismissed humans as weak now wrote reports warning that to engage them was to court disaster. The phrase circulated through encrypted channels. Do not press them to desperation. Political consequences soon followed. Old powers found their authority diminished as humanity's victories mounted. The coalition, once fractured by competing interests, began to coalesce around human leadership, not out of loyalty but necessity. Strategies centered increasingly on human-led initiatives, entire campaigns built upon their relentless momentum. The balance of centuries eroded, replaced by a future none had anticipated. The galaxy's perception of humanity shifted from irrelevance to inevitability. No longer were they the fragile newcomers tolerated in council chambers. They became the spear point of the war, the unpredictable factor that neither ally nor enemy could ignore. Their fleets were still smaller, their worlds fewer, but the weight of their will tilted the scales. The war, once stagnant, now surged forward under their influence. In every theater, the message became clear. Humanity did not fight as others did. They fought as though existence itself was at stake, and in doing so, they forced the galaxy to confront a terrifying truth: the rules of conflict had changed. Those who resisted this truth faltered. Those who adapted to it did so under the shadow of Earth's relentless determination. The galaxy trembled not at the size of human fleets or the brilliance of their technology, but at the certainty that wherever they appeared, the ground itself shifted. The war was no longer the same conflict it had been for millennia. It had become something sharper, fiercer, driven by a species that did not know how to stop. When the last of the great campaigns drew to a close, the galaxy no longer resembled the one that had existed before humanity's arrival. The old war had been a cycle, a rhythm of strikes and retreats that repeated without end. That rhythm was broken. The coalitions that had fought merely to preserve balance found themselves victorious, but victory itself carried an unfamiliar taste, because it was humanity's way of war that had carried them there. The cost was enormous. Human fleets were battered, their casualty list staggering, entire generations scarred. Worlds that had once known peace now bore monuments of stone and steel, names etched into endless walls. Yet even in grief, humanity refused to collapse inward. Where others might have withdrawn to lick their wounds, Earth doubled down. Survivors spoke not of exhaustion, but of duty. The war had shown them that their place among the stars could not be earned through trade alone. It had to be seized in fire. For the elder species, the aftermath brought disquiet. Their traditions of conflict had revolved around restraint, careful management of losses, and the expectation that stalemate would always return. Humanity erased that expectation. The war was no longer something that would simmer indefinitely. It had been concluded with finality in several regions because humans would not allow it to drag on. They fought until their enemies broke, and then they kept pressing until surrender was absolute. That precedent changed everything. Diplomacy bent under the weight of this new reality. Treaties once couched in cautious language were rewritten to account for human presence. No longer were they observers on the sidelines of galactic politics. They became anchors of decision-making. Their votes in council chambers carried disproportionate weight, not because of population or wealth, but because every faction knew what ignoring them might mean. To dismiss humanity was to risk igniting another unstoppable fire. Among enemies, the legends spread faster than reports. Children were warned with stories of human determination, soldiers trained with scenarios built entirely around facing them, and leaders plotted cautiously, always accounting for the possibility that humans might intervene. Fear had crystallized into something lasting, a cautionary instinct etched into cultures across the stars. The phrase repeated in hushed tones was no longer simply a warning, it had become doctrine: never force humanity into a corner. Yet humanity's rise was not defined solely by fear. Among their allies, admiration grew. The sight of human fleets fighting beyond endurance had left marks on countless civilizations. Entire cultures began reshaping themselves in response, drawing inspiration from human adaptability. Where once rigid tradition stifled innovation, now leaders pointed to Earth as proof that survival demanded change. Humans had not only altered the course of the war, they had altered the mindset of the galaxy itself. At home, Earth's people understood what they had done. They bore no illusions about their sacrifices, nor about the enemies they had made. They knew that with power came suspicion, and with legend came burden. But they accepted both. For the first time, humanity looked outward not as supplicants asking for recognition, but as equals, or rivals, among the stars. They had proven their place, and nothing could erase that proof. The galaxy trembled still, even in uneasy peace. Not from fresh battles, but from the knowledge that the fragile order rested upon the will of a species that had shown itself willing to pay any price. What had once been a quiet corner of the cosmos now cast a shadow across entire empires. Old rulers whispered of containing humanity, of limiting their influence, yet none dared provoke them directly. The risks were too clear, the memory of relentless campaigns too fresh. For humanity, the path forward was not without uncertainty. They faced the challenge of balancing their newfound power with the ideals they had fought for. The war had forced them to show their worst and their best, the fury of destruction alongside the resolve to defend. Now, they stood at the threshold of shaping the peace. Their future would decide whether the galaxy remembered them as liberators, tyrants, or something beyond both. But one truth had already been carved into the fabric of history. Humanity had entered the war as an underestimated newcomer, fragile and untested. They emerged as a force that reshaped everything they touched. They had not just joined the conflict, they had defined its conclusion. And in doing so, they had ensured that the galaxy would never again dismiss the species from Earth. The legend lingered in every sector: humanity was not the largest, nor the oldest, nor the strongest. But they were the ones who could not be broken. That legacy, forged in fire and sacrifice, outlived the war itself. Wherever their fleets traveled, allies felt hope, enemies felt dread, and the galaxy remembered the moment everything changed. The galaxy trembled when humanity joined the war. And it would never stop trembling again.